Welcome back, everyone, to Jane Austen and Company. My name is Anne Ferdig, and I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as the co-director and founder of Jane Austen and Company. We are delighted to see everyone here tonight for the fourth event in our series, Asia and the Regency. Tonight, we welcome Professor Noriyuki Harada to talk about translation and transformation of Pride and Prejudice in modern Japan. Some of you may recall that our co-host here tonight, Keio Ogawa, gave a great talk on Natsume Soseki and his inspiration from Jane Austen. Dr. Harada is going to continue that discussion tonight by looking at Austen's continued popularity in Japan. For those of you joining us for the first time tonight, Jane Austen and Company is a free public humanities series hosted by the Jane Austen Summer Program. Our mission is to bring free events and workshops on Jane Austen and her broader global context to audiences around the world. Tonight, I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Keio Ogawa, as well as our technical director, Jared Powell. We also have a special co-host here tonight, filling in for Dr. Inga Brody. I would like to introduce Susan Allen Ford, who some of you might recognize as the editor of the journal Persuasions, which is the peer-reviewed Jane Austen journal. Susan, would you like to say a word?
Sure. Good evening or good morning, depending on where in the world you are. I'm joining you from Mississippi. I've been an enthusiastic participant in the Jane Austen Summer Program since its beginning, and I'm now a member of its board. Last year, I gave a talk for this group on Jane Austen's reading in the Jane Austen at Home series. And like many of you, I've been a constant attendee for that series, for the Race in the Regency series, and now for Asia in the Regency. These lectures and discussions are doing a necessary and amazing job of opening new worlds and new ideas for us. I know we're all excited, so I'll now hand off things to our co-host, Keio Ogawa.
It is my pleasure to introduce Noriyuki Harada. Professor Noriyuki Harada is a teacher of English at Keio University, Japan, and former president of the English Literary Society of Japan, Nihon Eibun Gakkai. He got BA, MA, and PhD at Keio University. He started his teaching career at Keio University in 1994, and then worked for Tokyo Women's Christian University as a professor and dean. He's teaching at Keio as a professor at the Department of English since 2019. He's also working for the English Literary Society of Japan as president. For the Science Council of Japan. Japan University Accreditation Association and Dr. Johnson's house in London as a board of trustees. So he is in charge of many difficult positions, not just in Japan, but also abroad. As for his research, he's a specialist on 18th century novels and also translator of many novels such as Richardson's Pamela and Swift's Gulliver Travel. So when I began a project on a collection of essays on Johnson's reception in Japan, I had to ask him to join and contribute a piece. And he wrote a superb essay on Johnson's reception in Japan for this collection, which I highly recommend. So if you get a chance to read his essay on Johnson in Japan, that's also an exciting research work. So this book is called Johnson in Japan, and it came out from Bucknell University Press. Professor Harada's major fields, as I have been explaining, are early modern and modern English literature, mainly novels, comparative literature, and the history of book production in Britain. So, but before we hear from Dr. Harada, we need a few words of instruction from our technical director, Jared Powell. Jared?
Yes, thank you, Keio. Let me share my screen here. Okay, so I'm just going to take a moment to explain how tonight's event will work. So the event will last about 90 minutes in total. And throughout and after the presentation, you are welcome to put questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And so then at the end, Susan, Keio, and Anne will then ask those questions to Professor Harada. And if you would like to chat to other attendees, you can continue to post those comments and questions and thoughts in the chat, as many of you have been doing, letting us know where you're zooming in from. I love seeing all these locations all over the world. So as this slide here shows, questions for the speaker, which will be answered at Q&A at the end of the talk, or you use the Q&A button, conversation with other attendees, or if you need to get in touch with one of us, with me, if you're having technical difficulties, you'd use the chat, and just be sure that that drop-down menu is set to everyone. It might default to hosts and panelists, but if you want everyone to see it, you need to change that. There are going to be a few moments in Professor Harada's talk where he will ask questions of the audience and ask for responses. And so when those moments come up, do put those in the chat as well, and Anne will choose a few to read out. And then on that note, we also usually enjoy a robust chat. And so sometimes the notification bubble, some might want to hide that. And so if you're on PC, the way you would hide the chat is you first click that chat icon, and you should have a chat box pop out automatically. And then you can just click at the top and drag it off screen. If you are on Mac, it's a similar process, but there's one extra step. First, you click the chat again, and then you click the little arrow at the top to change it to a pop-out. And then once it's popped out, again, you grab it, drag it off. And finally, if you are on mobile or tablet, like an iPad, I know this works for an iPad as well, you would click or touch the chat and then the bell and then mute. And so that way, if those notification bubbles bother you, you can hide those off screen. And excuse me, my cat just jumped up on my desk. And then again, if you have issues with anything, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll keep my eye out to help with any sort of technical issues you might have. Thank you, and I believe we're back to Anne.
Thank you so much, Jared. Please note that tonight's program will be recorded. We typically post the edited versions on our website about a week or two after the event, and we'll notify you on our social media and through email when it is available to view. And without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Professor Noriyuki Harada.
Thank you very much for, sorry. Thank you very much for generous introduction. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Asia the Regency series organized by Jane Austen and Company. So can I share the screens?
Yes, you should be able to. There we go.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay. Excellent. That's working fine for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Oh, just a moment. Okay, Keio, thank you very much for generous introduction. I'm today's speaker, Noriyuki Harada. I'm professor of English at Keio University in Japan. And this university has the longest history among Japanese universities. And I'm enjoying reading and watching many interesting literary manuscripts and rare books of Japan and Western countries, as well as a variety of old and new buildings in the campus that is very close to the Imperial Palace and Tokyo Tower. I'm teaching graduate and undergraduate courses at the university, English literature in general, and in particular, English novels of the 18th and 19th centuries. I actually started my academic career with Dr. Samuel Johnson, a man of letters of the 18th century in England, and a lexicographer of the English language. Then my interest became widened. Jonathan Swift, Samuel Richardson, Jane Austen, some 19th and 20th century novelists, and comparative studies in Western and Japanese literature, as well as the history and culture of book production, came to be included in my research topics. And also, I have enjoyed translating some important works of English literature, including Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, Samuel Richardson's Pamela, Samuel Johnson's Lives of the English Poets, James Cook's Voyages, and recently, Albert Mangel's The History of Reading. The students of my seminar usually discuss as the topics of their graduation essays such authors like Afra Ben, Jonathan Swift, Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding, the Bronte sisters, Charles Dickens, Oscar Wilde, Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, George Orwell, Doris Lessing, Angela Carter, and Kazuo Ishiguro. Among them, however, Jane Austen is actually one of the most popular English novelists for the topic of graduation essays. So I am very glad to talk about her novels, and in particular, translation and transformation of Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Today, today, in order to show you some interesting aspects of Jane Austen's novels in Japan, I would like to talk about the following 3 points. First of all, I'd like to touch on briefly history and circumstances of the reception of Austen's novels in modern Japan. Then I will move to today's main topics. The popularity of Austen's novels has been grown by many translations or the process of translating her novels. I would like to show you some particular literary or cultural aspects that arise as a kind of difficulty in translating Austen's Pride and Prejudice. And I will ask you some questions about understanding of particular passages. And difficulties, as they may seem, however, they also show us very interesting topics by which we can deepen literary interpretations of Austen's novels. And those topics give us very interesting literary and interpretative exchanges among the modern readers of Austen's novels. So first of all, I begin my talk with a brief introduction of the reception of Austen's novels in modern Japan. In early modern period, Japan strictly limited overseas trade, and Holland, or the Netherlands, was the only Western country that was allowed to exchange commodities and information with Japan. Such governmental policy started in the middle of the 17th century and continued to 1854, the middle of the 19th century. During the times, some English novels might be known to a few Japanese intellectuals. For example, we can think of some possibilities that a few Japanese authors knew of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels through Dutch translations, and it had influence on some fanciful travel narratives of Japan in late 18th century and early 19th century. But there is no trace in which Austen's novels were conveyed to Japanese people during the time. However, after the policy ended in 1854, many Western people and commodities came to Japan, and the government actively imported Western cultures and technologies. Samuel Smiles' SelfHelp, which was originally published in London in 1859, is an anthology of biographies that show the success of individual efforts and resources to achieve things without excessive reliance on others. This Victorian biographical work was translated into Japanese by Masanao Nakamura. This is the right-hand side. And was widely read by Japanese common readers. In the age of drastic changes of governmental and social institutions and those of old class systems, Japanese people were eager for the idea of self-help illustrated in the book. Nakamura's translation sold surprisingly well, and the number of copies exceeded 1 million until early 20th century. Jane Austen's novels were first introduced at the time, but the way of introduction seems to be a little different from that of Samuel Smiles' self-help. Lafcadio Hearn, who was born in Greece, educated in Ireland and England, immigrated to America, and finally got a teaching post at the University of Tokyo that was newly founded in 1870s, memorably referred to Austen's novels in his lectures on English literature. Hearn became naturalized in Japan, got married with a Japanese woman, and published many fairy tales based on Japanese settings. It is certain that Hearn was in academic atmospheres when he gave lectures on Austen, but he was a journalist in New York and also came to be involved in creative writing in Japan. He is supposed to have said to some students that delicate shades observed in Austen's novels are difficult for Japanese students to understand. His reference to Austen's novels and this ironic comment make us suppose reasonably that his standpoint itself as a university professor was delicate or ambiguous. Hearn taught at the University of Tokyo from 1896 to 1903, and after his resignation, Soseki Natsume, this is the right-hand side, this one. Soseki Natsume succeeded in his post and gave a substantial introduction to Austen's literature in the early 20th century. Natsume was born in Tokyo, graduated from the Department of English at the University of Tokyo, and studied in London for 2 years at the end of the 19th century. He published 2 scholarly books on English literature that were based on his lectures at the university. One is Literary Review of English Literature, which was published in 1909, in which he mainly discussed English literature of the 18th century. And the other is Theory of Literature, 1907, whose focus was 19th century English literature. In the latter, Natsume often refers to Austen's novels and states that Austen is the greatest author of realistic novels. Interestingly, like Hearn, Natsume resigned the post at the university and moved to writing his own creative works. He himself later became one of the greatest novelists in modern Japan. This one. Toyoichiro Nogami attended Natsume's lectures and graduated from the university in 1903. In 1906, he married Yaeko Nogami, whom I discussed later, and got a post of English language and English literature at Hosei University, a private university. 20 years later, he published the first full translation of Pride and Prejudice with Yaeko's assistance. He had an interest in Japanese traditional theatrical performance called No, and gave some lectures on No in London and Cambridge in 1938, just before World War II. Yaeko Nogami did not attend Natsume's lectures, but Natsume sent many letters to her and gave useful advice for literary interpretation and creative writing. Besides the brief history mentioned above, we can of course point out some interesting adaptations of her novels in modern Japan. For example, Reiko Mochizuki published the manga version of Pride and Prejudice in 2009, and Takarazuka, one of the most famous theatrical companies in Japan that consists only of actresses, presented a play entitled Angel's Ladder, an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice on the stage in 2012. However, what I'd like to concentrate my focus on today is the popularity of Austen's novels observed in consecutive publication of many translations in modern Japan. The popularity in Japanese translations of her novels is far wider, and it seems more interesting to note. It also seems more important for us to think about the possibilities of interpretation of Austen's novels in global context of the 21st century. As this slide shows, at least 6 versions of translation of Austen's Pride and Prejudice are now available for Japanese common reader. Even the translation of Pembury, Emma Tennant's sequel of Pride and Prejudice, originally published in 1993, is available, and Japanese people can buy them at local bookshops or, of course, through internet. Japanese translations of Austen's other novels are similarly available, at least as far as her 6 major novels are concerned. I will discuss why six different versions of translation of the original coexist among Japanese common reader. But anyway, we can say that the publication of translation of Austen's novels pays well, and Austen's novels are popular even if most of the common reader do not have the occasion of reading the English originals. This situation means that at least 60,000 people among the total Japanese population of actually 120 million population purchase and read the translation of Pride and Prejudice in the period of some 5 years. I mean, 6 versions, and each translation has copies of 10,000 within a few years, some 5 years. Although the figure might not be astounding so much, it nevertheless shows kind of persistence among Japanese common reader for reading Austen's novels. Habit of reading or love of reading, traditionally observed in the Japanese common reader, may be one of the reasons for this persistence. Because of the spread of numerous private academies, the literacy of Japanese people already reached nearly to 80% at the end of the 18th century. 80% in the 18th century. Before modernization, that was accelerated since from the middle of the 19th century, reading habit of Japanese people was well established. Actually, it was more than 1,000 years ago that one of the most popular tales or novels was made. Murasaki Shikibu, a female author, finished her Tales of Genji in 1008, and the work was circulated originally in the form of handwritten copies and later by printing and publication. Tales of Genji has, of course, a highly aesthetic element, as Bazhnev, a famous English novelist of the 20th century, evaluated, and its stylized and polished aspect might be different from the common reader's curiosity. But we can say with fair certainty that the early spread of the early spread of the common reader undoubtedly supported the inheritance of the masterpiece of the 11th century, and the long history of love of reading among Japanese people can be observed even today to some degree. However, in the process of modernization after the middle of the 19th century, Japanese people naturally wanted to read modern topics in the novels, far different from the courtly love of ancient Japan or humorous events in the age of feudalism. They tried to find the essence of modernity and of the society that was being transformed rapidly. It was Yaeko Nogami who read Austen's novels in original and earnest and tried to make her own novels in these circumstances. As mentioned above, Yaeko Nogami got married with Toyoichiro in 1906. Teaching English and English literature at Hosei University, Toyoichiro came to be involved in many translations of English literary works. The first full Japanese translation of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels was also made by Toyoichiro in 1927, the next year of the full Japanese translation of Pride and Prejudice. Yaeko, assisting her husband's translation, and carefully read the original of Pride and Prejudice. She said, I have been reading Pride and Prejudice in the original since I was young. If you are asked to list some of your favorite protagonists from English novels and plays, you'll probably choose Elizabeth of Pride and Prejudice first. I think everyone can be drawn to her intellect, the cheerful and generous wisdom that underpins it, and the lively passion associated with candidness and a sense of justice without any vanity. Trying to write her own novel, she kept Austen's literary world, and in particular, the characterization of Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice in mind. She said in high spirits, if you write a long piece, you have to go in this way, like Pride and Prejudice. I want to write a full-length novel with this kind of handling. Then she finished her own novel, Machiko, in 1931. Machiko is the name of heroine of the novel, and she thought that she could have well described a new woman in modern Japan. But when she read again Austen's Pride and Prejudice, she was obliged to confess that I thought Machiko at least could rival Austen's Pride and Prejudice, but I now feel that my piece cannot be a match for it at all. Holding a sort of feeling of frustration, she tried to tackle with Pride and Prejudice again, writing her own Niji no Hana. The literal meaning of Niji no Hana is rainbow flowers, and the framework of the novel was closer to Pride and Prejudice. It may be called an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, but because of that, we can say Niji no Hana seems to be different from those works in which she satisfyingly exhibited her own literary creativity in later years. However, it seems reasonable to suppose that her consciousness of Austen's characters well formed the basis for the characterization of her later novels. In particular, Elizabeth's intellect, the cheerful and generous wisdom that underpins it, and the lively passion associated with candidness and a sense of justice without vanity, were deeply permeated into her literary mind. Modernization of Japanese society naturally needed the change of the way of living and thinking of the people. Although Natsume said to her that you should be a human before you are a woman, and she thought highly of this advice throughout her life, Yaeko nevertheless needed to make a special effort for being a woman novelist, and for describing new women in her novels. Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and in particular Elizabeth in the novel, was absolutely new for her in terms of the way of modern living of women and of the way a woman was described in modern novels. And taking the great influence of Yaeko Nogami's influence on modern Japanese literary history into consideration, we can say with fair certainty that Austen's influence on modern Japanese literary trend through Yaeko should not be overlooked. At the same time, however, we should evaluate more popular and direct influence of Austen's novels on Japan. It is observed in modern Japanese education of English language. Needless to say, the education of English language and that of English literature are different. But when Japan opened widely the doors to the world in the middle of the 19th century, the people needed to study both the English language and the contents expressed by the language. The contents included not only tools and technologies, but also cultures, thoughts, abstract ideas, and Western ways of expressing imagination. This was not so familiar even to Japanese intellectuals. Literature is, of course, helpful to nourish imagination, and accordingly, it is sometimes used in language education. But in the case of Japan, the emphasis was placed on the academic aspects of the contents rather than the practice. In addition, it was actually efficient to teach the contents with the with the mother tongue rather than with a foreign language. Consequently, native speakers of English language who were employed in universities and high schools in the middle and late 19th century were gradually replaced by Japanese professors and teachers. It shows well the situation that the post at the University of Tokyo that Rafkadio Han held was replaced by Soseki Natsume at the beginning of the 20th century. And also, it should not be overlooked that intellectual and academic atmosphere or a sense of priority came to be added to learning English language. Even today, learning English is often associated in Japan with new and wide knowledge and the globalization of the society. One of the reasons why various translations of Austen's novels have consecutively appeared is that the translations have been used not simply for literary curiosity of the common reader, but for the study of the language. This may seem ironic in a sense, but because of this, the publication of various translations in Japan have the possibility of bringing new and academically reasonable interpretations to Austen's novels. And I am teaching English literature at Keio University, but previously taught it at Tokyo Women's Christian University for 10 years. Tokyo Women's Christian University has the long history of women education in modern Japan and has a good reputation of English language teaching and the education of English literature. The students often read some novels of English or American novels in the first year or the second year courses for training the competency of the English language, even if their subjects are not always English literature. One of the most popular novels that the students read in those courses of basic English is Austen's novels, though the materials are usually abridged versions. Interestingly, the students whose subjects are not English literature nevertheless become interested in Austen's novels. Some of them try to read through the novels discussed in the courses in English, and others, of course, want to read it by its translations. Such a mixed education of language training and reading novels is widely observed in Japanese universities. Of course, there has been a criticism about using literary text or emphasizing literature in the course of practical language training. But undoubtedly, many students develop their interest in Austen's novels. The common readers of Japanese translations of Austen's novels obviously include those students and the graduates who got such an education. Then the students whose subjects are English literature will write their graduation essays in the third and fourth year in this university. In the case of Tokyo Women's Christian University, the students of English department are approximately 50 students, though the department has about 100 students. That means, the qualification for writing graduation essays is limited, and other students need to take some other courses. The students of English department, approximately 50 students, can choose a wide variety of topics. Not only English literature, but also American literature, comparative literary studies, translation theories, linguistics, philology, and cultural studies are included in their options. This slide roughly shows the number of the students who chose the individual authors or topics in their graduation essays in 1970, 1975, 1980, 1985, and 1990. Even this rough sketch well shows the students' general tendency, inclination, and favorite authors. Without doubt, Austen is one of the most popular English novelists, exceeding sometimes even Shakespeare. So far, I have talked about the historical and cultural context by which the translations of Austen's novels are widely spread in modern Japan. But more importantly, the translations themselves have interesting points to note, and they have the possibilities to deepen our own interpretations of the novels in modern and global context. I would like to show now some of the points, quoting and illustrating original passages and their translations from Pride and Prejudice. The first example illustrates Austen's appropriateness and preciseness of setting the narrator's viewpoint, that they are more clearly distinguished when we compare the original with its Japanese translation. Needless to say, the narrator of a novel takes various viewpoints. Sometimes the narrator is close and sympathetic to the protagonist, but other times the narrator is neutral and takes objective distance from every character. Please look at this slide of the beginning scene of Pride and Prejudice. Austen starts her narration with neutral and objective tone. This is a famous sentence. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. This neutral and objective tone is carefully kept in the next paragraph. In the second paragraph, the focus is changed from a universal truth to everyday life of a neighborhood, but the neutrality should be kept in order to show that the events of the Bennets are usual, not specific. Because of this, the characterization of Elizabeth can give strong impression to the reader, I think. Obviously, Austen succeeds in keeping the neutrality of narration in the second paragraph. But the difficulty arises when one tries to translate this paragraph into Japanese. In particular, a neighborhood and the rightful property are the words that Japanese translators feel difficulty about neutrality. For this slide, as this slide shows, the translated Japanese word of a neighborhood that seems to be most appropriate here, and actually most translators use here, means a place close to someone. And as there is no concept of articles in Japanese, this translated Japanese word is inevitably engaged with a subjectivity. And the rightful property, too, is difficult to translate properly. Austen keeps the neutrality of the narration here, and the words rightful property seem to reflect such an author's point of view. However, the usual Japanese word for property is close to estate, and it is clearly unsuitable in this context. Japanese translators, therefore, have tried hard to contrive a good way to be faithful to the neutrality observed in the original, but the problem still remains to be solved. The second example illustrates the difficulty in understanding the original implication. This is the scene of a ball where Elizabeth and Darcy encounter for the first time. Darcy's comment on the appearance of Elizabeth is well known, but it is not necessarily easy to find suitable Japanese words for tolerable, handsome, and tempt. Does tolerable, for example, mean here something to put up with, not bad or okay? Darcy changes his first impression of Elizabeth just after the scene. Austen describes it, no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she had hardly a good feature in her face than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. Translators need to avoid irrelevance caused by the translated word for tolerable and Darcy's later change. In addition, Darcy's saying in this scene includes puzzling italicized me. Does the italics mean Darcy's haughtiness? If it expresses his haughtiness, what kind of haughtiness does Austen imply? Does he simply want to show the difference between himself and Bingley? Or is he proud of his own handsomeness? Of course, but of course he is not good at enjoying conversation with women. Various connotations and implications that the original words, phrases, and sentences have will express Austen's minute observation and smooth and witty narration. Therefore, they should be evaluated highly in her novels, but because of them, translators are originally obliged to feel difficulty in translating those connotations and implications. And I'd like to ask you all, what sort of feeling or impressions do you have about these words, tolerable or handsome and tempt and italicized me?
Please feel free to put your comments in the chat too as he continues to present.
Thank you very much. The next slide, the next example also illustrates such a difficulty, but in this case, the difficulty is caused not only by complicated connotations and implications, but also by historical and cultural differences. This is the scene in which, after declining Darcy's first proposal, Elizabeth took a walk in the morning of the next day. Austen describes Elizabeth again with a sort of neutrality. She was proceeding directly to her favorite walk when the recollection of Mr. Darcy's sometimes coming there stopped her, and instead of entering the park, she turned up the lane, which led farther from the turnpike road. The park of Catherine du Bac, the park paling was still the boundary on one side, and she soon passed one of the gates into the ground. Elizabeth is obviously upset. She tries to avoid bumping into Darcy, so that she turns up the lane instead of entering the park. But Darcy's presence in her mind clearly increased. The expression of the park paling was still the boundary on one side, well expresses her vacillation of whether she should be with Darcy or not. But the usual translated Japanese word for turnpike road simply or abruptly means a toll road. And of course, it does not seem to be suitable in this context. What does the turnpike road signify here? Fiona Stafford kindly gave a note on the turnpike road for us in Oxford Words Classics version. It is a road kept up by tolls charged to travelers. The system was established in the late 17th century, but was much improved in the later 18th century, making travel easier and therefore more popular. Yes, so we may say that Austen implies here a new prospect of Elizabeth's life using a newly popularized word of turnpike road. Actually, we have some pictures of the early 19th century turnpike road. This is the scene near Oxford. However, in the historical context, the word means that a spiked barrier affixed in or across a road or passage as a defense against sudden attack, especially of men on horseback. And this historical meaning was, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, used at least until the middle of the 18th century. Obviously, Austen knew both meanings of turnpike road, and it seems reasonable to suppose that Austen made good use of the double entendre to describe Elizabeth's vacillation vividly. And of course, the English common reader may have this kind of conjecture for new interpretation, but for the Japanese common reader, the sense of discomfort caused by the translated Japanese word of toll road in this scene naturally promotes an inquiry of the literal and literary meaning of the turnpike road. The next example illustrates Austen's swift change of the focal character in her narration, which is also recognized through difficulty in translation. The slide shows the scene following the turnpike road scene. Elizabeth at last sees Darcy. Though Elizabeth moved toward the gate, Darcy already reached the gate and holding out a letter which she instinctively took, said with a look of haughty composure, "I have been walking in the glove some time in the hope of meeting you. Will you do me the honor of reading the letter?" About the custom of handing a letter, Fiona Stafford again gives us a good note, and the common reader can understand one of the historical context of the scene. But the part the Japanese translators feel difficulty is the swift changes of the focal character. First of all, Darcy reaches the gate and holds out the letter, and then Elizabeth instinctively takes, and finally Darcy says with a look of haughty composure. This sentence can be translated into Japanese faithfully, of course, but relative clauses that are very common in English are hardly used in Japanese. As a result, relative clause is usually compressed into an adjective phrase or extended to a coordinate clause. This means that Austen's swift change of the focal character is apt to be reduced too shortly or to become verbose in Japanese translation. But due to such a limit of translation or difference of linguistic system of both languages, we can recognize one of the excellencies of her narration. The last example of today's talk illustrates Austen's attentiveness observed in casual expressions. The passage in this slide is about Elizabeth's journey to Pembury. with Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. Here, Austen inserts a sort of excuse. It is not the object of this work to give a description of Derbyshire, nor of any of the remarkable places through which their route Caesar lay, Oxford, Brenham, Warwick, Kenilworth, Birmingham, and so on, are sufficiently known. This excuse, and she states that a small part of Derbyshire is all the present concern. But as Fiona Stafford again gives us a good explanation of the places that the party visits, we need to read carefully the enumeration of remarkable places. In particular, it should be noted that Birmingham at early 19th century was quite different from other historic towns. But how should Japanese translators reflect Austen's insertion of Birmingham into historic towns in spite of her own comment that it is not the object of this work to give a description of Derbyshire, nor of any of the remarkable places through which their route Caesar lay? Some of the Japanese translators of the scene have made good use of the result of topographical studies and show us in their notes that the enumeration symbolizes the journey from a familiar place for Elizabeth, like Oxford, to the unfamiliar Birmingham, or the journey from her life surrounded by neighbors, relatives, friends, and acquaintances to her new life with Darcy at Pembury. Now, I'd like to conclude my talk. The popularity of Austen's novels, especially of Pride and Prejudice, can be explained from some points of view. We know of the long history of Japanese people's reading habit, and also modernization from the middle of the 19th century was obviously in favor of the spread of Japanese translations of Austen's novels. For the importance of the English language was emphasized in the process of modernization, and the language education often contained some teaching materials from Austen's novels. But Japanese translators' difficulties in making translations and their creativity in dealing with those difficulties are more interesting. The translators facing various difficulties deal with them successfully. Such processes of translation can be called faithful but creative, and the translations lead to useful and literary interpretations for understanding Austen's original novels. Therefore, we can say with fair certainty that the popularity of the translation of Austen's novels in Japan and accompanying various interpretations will reflect the richness of Austen's literary world. Thank you very much for listening and watching.
Thank you so much, Professor Harada. We are going to start the Q&A, and I want to remind you all that you can continue to put questions in the Q&A box if you would like us to ask them to Professor Harada. But to begin the Q&A, I would like to give a little summary of the audience reaction to your questions on the translations. And particularly the lines, you know, I suppose she is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, of which there was a great discussion in the chat of all of the multiple ways that could be, one, interpreted in English, and two, how we can carry that over. The three big things seem to be, one, this sense of mood of Darcy that is configured. We understand that in the moment, he is not pleased to be there. He is, as one commenter said, cranky. So we get him in that moment. We also get a sense of either what is being debated of self-importance or arrogance, and what some people interpret as his shyness with this statement, this reluctance to go out and dance and socialize. And last, we also are given a sense of his relationship with others, with the italics that you pointed out. His, not handsome enough to tempt me compared to other men, compared to Bingley and compared to others, which I think just goes to show how that one line tells us so much. In your opinion, Professor Harada, is this similar or different to the kinds of reactions you see in your students when they read those similar passages, whether it's in English or Japanese?
Sorry. Yes. Yes, I think so.
How is that,
yeah.
How is that similar or different?
Yes,
do you see those same reactions in your Japanese students?
Yes. Usually when we teach the passages to Japanese students, we usually use Japanese words, not English. So that is a very problematic situation, and actually tolerable cannot be suitably translated into Japanese. And actually, I cannot find a good word for tolerable and handsome. Actually, handsome sometimes means beautiful, and of course, commonly agreeable, attractive, and but the translated words of those English words are not suitable in this context. And in addition, italic style is very strange for Japanese students, because the Japanese language does not have italicized letters. So sometimes students use italicized letters in titles of books and articles, but and sometimes, of course, emphasizing italics used in students' papers in English. But of course, the real meaning or implication within these italics are very difficult for Japanese students to understand, I think.
Professor Harada, we have a question from someone who asks, Nogami learned about the modern woman, you said, from Pride and Prejudice. But at that point, the novel was already 100 years old. What do you think made Austen's Regency sensibility appeal as modern in early 20th century Japan?
Yes, very interesting question, and of course, I think yes, for Nogami, even for Nogami, Austen's novels were 100 years old, and so a century earlier. But I think even in England, Austen's revaluation of Austen's novels happened in the 19th century or late 19th century. I mean, just after Austen died, her novels, her novels were forgotten for some period, and then Austen Lee's biography appeared in late 19th century, and Austen's novels were reevaluated in the context of late Victorian period. So in this sense, I think Nogami was as a sort of contemporary to English readers, the readers in England.
Yes, thank you.
There's also a very interesting question about the word handsome. you discuss this phrase, she's tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me. This person wants to know the similar usage, or maybe a different usage, of handsome. Isn't handsome how Austen describes Emma, which is meant as a compliment? What do you think?
Oh, yes, I think so. Yes, I showed some candidate words, translated words, or candidate meanings of tempt in my slide: entice, incline, persuade. But they are not, they are different from the tempt in this context. And usually in my course, I told students, I tell students the variety of connotations and implications itself, but I cannot choose one of them. And yes, as you mentioned, Emma is the passage from Emma is very useful for students to compare the connotation and implication observed in this tempt.
And in Japanese too, I mean, handsome has completely different meaning in Japanese.
Different, yes.
In Japanese, handsome simply means good looks for men, not ever for women, right? So again, this gendered usage of the term handsome in Japan complicates the translating process from English into Japanese. So I guess, so it's even more difficult for Japanese translator to think about the word handsome. Is it a masculine taste that possibly Emma and Elizabeth has, or is Darcy aware of that kind of masculinity, or is there any masculine kind of element in this word handsome originally in English? I don't know. So this is, for Japanese people especially, it's a very tricky word to translate.
Yes, very tricky. Yes.
We have a question about the idea of the courtship in Pride and Prejudice and these ideals of romantic love in Austen. Especially 100 years ago, how did Japanese readers receive these ideas?
I think, the case of the courtly love described in Tales of Genji is quite different from early modern Japan, first of all. And, 18th and 19th century Japan, before and after reopening the country to the world, filled with feudalism and very, discrimination of women, very strong. So I think Hoyaeko Nogami, Elizabeth's attitude toward Darcy is very new, and new among old atmosphere of Japanese feudalism.
We have another question. Can you speak to the translation of the class and caste system in the hierarchy of Austen's novels versus the Japanese view through the decades?
Yeah. Yes. First of all, the most of Japanese common reader think that Darcy and Bingley are belonging, affiliating to aristocrats, but they are actually gentry, and so most of leaders cannot distinguish aristocracy from gentries from aristocracy. And so usually most of the Japanese readers think that aristocracies and gentries are, generally upper class, and we are middle. And some people, under middle. So this view of class and caste systems observed in Japan, gave a difficulty in exactly understanding the class system of described in Austen's novels.
Did that? How do you see that playing out in terms of the different translations? Or
yeah.
can you?
Yeah, actually, the Japanese vocabularies for explaining Japanese system of feudalism or caste system are now obsolete, even at the time of Yaeko no Gami. Because the middle 19th century saw the change of language itself. So the language itself changed from old system to the new system. A sort of improvement of language, that sort of movement happened in the middle of the 19th century. So I think actually the Japanese students now do not have a vocabulary itself for explaining Japanese caste system or class systems, at least in the usual days in everyday life.
Thank you.
There's two-part questions for Professor Harada. One, how has Pride and Prejudice and its interpretations in Japan changed throughout the years? And has its multiple translations play a part in these changes? This is the first part of a question. Second part, what themes are commonly discussed in classrooms when Pride and Prejudice is discussed? And how do you think these themes vary when it is read in katakana or hiragana than in English? I think this person means kanji as well. This person left out the crucial part of Japanese language, which is kanji. So I think these two-part questions very interesting because, for example, Koyama Taichi is a more recent translator who entitled Pride and Prejudice as Koman to Jifu to Henken. Jifu is not Koman. So Pride has been translated into two completely different language in Japanese. So the first Koman is the more traditional, general, widely accepted version of pride, Koman, which means literally arrogance. Whereas Koyama Taichi translated this pride into a completely different word, which is jifu, right? Which just simply means self-confidence. So I think this person's question is relevant to that sort of change, right? I mean, some people understand pride as being koma, arrogance. People like Koyama Taichi understands pride as self-confidence. So, so maybe the questions is very interesting, and that, how has the reception changed over the years, and how do you teach these changes in themes like pride or whatever to your students in classroom setting?
Yes, first of all, I think translations, Japanese translations, of course, changed from the early period to recent days. But I think as far as the translations from Austen's novels are concerned, I think, you know, a Japanese translator can translate at least superficial meaning truly and faithfully. So the problems lies in the connotation and the implications. And so even early translations in Japan, in modern Japan, show a sort of faithful translation, or at least you know, the translation shows a superficial meaning of Austen's novels, but the implication and connotations cannot be translated into early period of translation, Japanese translation. And recently, the focus of Austen's translation, the Japanese translation, moves to implication and connotation. And so, you know, Keio kindly suggested that, you know, pride, that translation of pride changed from Coleman to Jif, or something like that. That sort of things that, you know, this is very important things. And of course, the problem whether this is faithful or not is included. But anyway, the difference between Coleman and Jif in the word pride means connotation and implication or interpretations. So translators' interest in Austen's novels, I think moved from faithful translation or prosaic translation to more you know, deep, or the problems of implication and connotation, I think.
Or even creative.
Yes, creative, sometimes creative, yes. Thank you. And in my class, you know, of course, yes, I often talk about this change of translation, but there's another problem, because you know, when we want to study the situation, real situation of early Japanese translation of Austen's novels, we face to the difference of kanji characters. You know, before World War II, the kanjis, you know, we Japanese people had a very old style of kanjis, but after that, we Japanese people changed the style of kanji to new one. So usually Japanese student cannot read the old kanjis published before World War II. So I usually emphasize reading original text, and of course, you know, students' understanding often limited about you know, understanding of the original word or concepts. But anyway, English original is very important. And so this is my attitude towards you know, using Austen's novels in my courses.
Thank you so much. I think that the difficulty of capturing the connotation is so relevant to so many of these questions. And we have someone else who's very interested in that idea. They're asking if Mr. and Mrs. Bennet's bantering translates well culturally in Japan. What do readers take away about the relationship of the Bennets?
Yes. Sorry. Your question is about you know,
Mr. and Mrs. Mrs. Bennet, how do their relationship translate? Do people see them as humorous? Are they kind of seen as the worst married couple ever? How is that? Does the kind of subtext of their relationship survive the translation into Japanese?
Yes, I think Soseki Natsume understood the background and the context of Mr. and Mrs. the Bennets as a sort of a very usual, very everyday life, like something like that. And Soseki said that, Natsume said that, Austen is, of course, the great author of the realistic novels. But one point is difficult, even for Austen to write. That is the catching a cold. Usually people catch a cold, once in a month or twice in a month. So catching a cold is very usual things, everyday life. But even in Austen's novels, even in the great author of realistic novel, catching a cold sometimes catching a cold brings a sort of change of plot. The character catches a cold, and then plot changes or story develops from the illness. But in normal life, catching a cold is simply troublesome things. But life does not change. So anyway, Soseki Natsume, remarks Austen's way of describing everyday life, and the Bennets are very important example of Austen's very good description of everyday life in her novels.
I think that sort of attests to some of that continuing appeal, that people can still read the Bennets and understand that relationship.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have another question from somebody about the response of your students to Pride and Prejudice. This person says she or he and readers from her country can still relate to themes used in Austen's works during the Regency era, like the marriage market, the constant worry to get the daughter settled, or class struggle. How is the reader's response in your classes? Do your students today relate to those themes?
Yes, very interesting and important topic, I think. But usually, but unfortunately, I think recently Japanese students, not only Japanese students, I think, this is the phenomenon all over the world. But anyway, the students now, the historical consciousness, historical awareness, the awareness of history itself, I think becomes weakening among younger generations, and the history or the space of time or something like that, very difficult for teachers to teach. So I think regency, the problems or topics of regency, and of course the problems, social problems observed in Japanese early modern period are very important for them. But nevertheless, their consciousness of the problems in early modern years or in Regency, and very the consciousness it becomes weak, and so first of all, I need to enhance the students' consciousness of history itself. And sometimes actually some students or many students are confused 17th century, 18th century, the phenomenon of 17th century, 18th century, and 19th century. They confused 17th century things with 19th century things, or 18th century things with Renaissance things. So that I think this is a real situation of my course.
What about a sense of seeing the concerns in, that of the past that Austen represents reflected in the present? Is that clear there at all? So do your students, for instance, kind of feel some sense of parental pressure to marry, or class consciousness that Austen is also speaking to?
Yes. Yes, I think, yeah. I think one of the most strong points that students want to read Austen's novels is a sort of distance to the novel. Japanese situation is different from the situation of Regency and the situation surrounding Austen's family, and so I think this distance bring a sort of strong impression to the students, and so even in this different situation, Elizabeth's life or Elizabeth's saying, Elizabeth's words seems to be very persuasive for Japanese student, even in English, I think.
Yeah.
So I think of course, a literary scholar need to explain the historical situations or very minute, detailed situations of Austen's novels, and I usually do. But I think students' consciousness seems to be directed to a sort of distance from the objects of the novel, and nevertheless they feel sort of, or nevertheless, or because of that, I think they feel characters' words straightforwardly or directly.
Thank you.
I think what Susan brought up is a very important for all Japanese women today, especially when we read Nogami Yaeko's work, or when we read Austen's work through Nogami Yaeko's adaptation entitled Machiko, because Machiko represents the new woman of Taisho period of the early 20th century. That's exactly when Virginia Woolf was writing Room of One's Own.
Yes.
So obviously what Harada Sensei is saying is true. We do have distance from all these women in the past, including Jane Austen and Nogami Yaeko. But through these women, our female students actually do feel like Harada Sensei just said, they feel that Elizabeth's words are so convincing, and it's so actual and even universal, the kind of struggle that we are going through at the moment, especially in Japan, believe it or not, so many women today actually accept proposal of men because they think that, perhaps they can't become economically independent if they reject the proposal today, So there's another very interesting question from our audience about Mr. Collins' marriage proposal. What did your students think of Elizabeth's rejection of Mr. Collins' marriage proposal? Did anyone think she should have accepted? It would have helped her family, is what this person says. And a lot of my female students are always wavering between these two poles. Should I accept a marriage proposal today in the 21st century, even if the man is just like Mr. Collins? I mean, at least my students feel that kind of struggle all the time. What about your students, Harada Sensei?
Yeah, yes. Frankly speaking, 40% of students are surprisingly sympathetic to Collins. And 60% are of course very sympathetic to agree with Elizabeth, but nevertheless 40% are very sympathetic to Collins.
That's really high. I'm very shocked.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not shocked because I live in Japan. It's such a feudalistic society we live in. It's so hard for teachers to explain to students that you can actually try and become economically independent. I guess it's the structure of our society is still very feudalistic, in that a lot of women give up full-time job to raise their kids. Even if they start working as a full-time worker, they think that they cannot actually juggle between work and home, or work and households. So it's Austen's popularity in Japan perhaps has something to do with our feudalistic culture or patriarchal culture. Well, that's probably what Harada Sensei is trying to get at by saying 40% of your students sympathize with Mr. Collins.
Yes, and also I think a student cannot understand a sort of a humorous dealing with Austen's dealing with Collins. So they understand Austen's words directly, very some students say that Austen is very very hard for Collins, and so they have a negative attitude toward Austen's caricature or satirical description of Collins. And sometimes those students move from Austen to the Bronte sisters.
Thank you so much. This was such a fascinating conversation, and I certainly learned so much. So I'd like to thank Professor Harada once again for joining us here tonight, and to thank everyone in the audience for joining us. I think this is probably one of our best chats so far. People were really digging into the text, and it was wonderful to see so many questions. So please stick around. We have a few more announcements to make before we say goodbye. First of all, I would like to remind you guys of our next two events in the Asia and the Regency series. On January 27th, Tristan Connolly is going to be talking about Asia, or Emma in Bollywood. If you haven't seen Asia, it is a really fun adaptation of Emma that takes a lot of its cues from Clueless. And if you're in the United States, it is available on Hulu and for rent on Amazon Prime. So there's still time to watch the film and then come see Tristan on January 27th. And I don't want to call Tristan out, but I did see her in the audience tonight. So Tristan, if you're still there, say hi to everyone. And then on February 11th, Barnita Bagchi is talking about Jane Austen in India and Jane Austen and India. She's going to start her talk by exploring the Austen's family's connections with India, before introducing us to Kashibai Konakar, a 19th century Indian woman writer who was inspired by Jane Austen. Now, you guys might know this, but Jane Austen and Company originally started as a reading group in Durham Public Library. We were reading women authors contemporaneous with Jane Austen. So this is a really wonderful way to return to our roots and to learn about a new historical female writer. As always, these events are free and you can register at janeaustenandco.org/sign up. And I will drop that link in the chat.
Yes, and if you want to read more about Jane Austen, her life, afterlives, and adaptations, check out the blog for the Jane Austen Summer Program or follow us on social media. JASP, as is the parent program of Jane Austen and Company, it is a 4-day summer symposium that typically takes place in June in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Next year, well, this year actually, Happy New Year. This year's theme is Austen and Shakespeare, and it will take place from June 16th through 19th, 2022. So join us for lectures, hands-on workshops, small discussion groups, exhibits, and other activities that blend scholarship with fandom. Registration will be opening in the next few weeks and it always sells out, so please keep an eye on our website, janeaustensummer.org.
And tonight, 170 of us got to hear Dr. Harada's wonderful talk. This program was supported by the North Carolina Humanities Council, an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities at www.nchumanities.org. We would also like to thank the University of North Carolina's Humanities for Public Good, a project of the College of Arts and Sciences with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Carolina Asia Center for their support for our program. Please consider making a gift to the Jane Austen Summer Program. We're a registered nonprofit, so your donations are tax deductible in the United States. Donations help keep Jane Austen and Company events free and open to the public. They allow us to bring in wonderful speakers like Noriyuki Harada. They also go to supporting our other activities, such as our student essay contests and our annual teacher scholarships, which enable middle school and high school teachers to win scholarships to attend our in-person conferences for free. So thank you all again for attending, and we hope you remain healthy and safe until we meet again.
Good night.
Good night,
Thank you very much.
everybody.
Thank you very much.
Good morning.
Yes. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.